If you look back on the history of the survival horror genre, you'll find a humble beginning, a brief golden age, and then a long stretch of very polarizing but experimental releases. Although some would argue that survival horror ended in that golden age. But during that age, there were two names that stood out on top: Resident Evil and Silent Hill. For what felt like the longest time, these two franchises were thrown at each other constantly, arguments about which one was better getting more and more heated with each release. But obviously, based on the title and length of this video, I'm not here to talk about that particular feud. After all, I think the argument was dead in 2005 and buried in 2007. I bring it up because, when we look at Resident Evil, it's still going strong. It has stumbled in the past and likely will again, don't get me wrong, but it always seems to bounce back. And each time it does, it brings new players to the series through its experimentation. Then you look at Silent Hill. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, there are more mediocre and flat-out bad games in the series than there are good ones at this point. So, despite the history behind the name, less and less people are being exposed to one of the best survival horror games ever made. People will typically bring up Silent Hill 2 because of its reputation and story, but then that's it. Now, I'm not saying Silent Hill is some kind of cult classic, or that the reputation of Silent Hill 2 is unwarranted, but it's overlooked when compared to other games due to its age, gameplay, pace, compared to modern offerings at least, and the fact that getting a copy and the means to play is a little more work than your average person would want to put in. Now let's say Konami's current efforts to bring attention to the series works, and let's also say a new Silent Hill comes out. I don't know if even then you'll have people flock back to the core roots of the series, and that's a shame, because Silent Hill is a great survival horror game, and in some cases has yet to be topped. So the first thing to bring up when discussing the decision to play Silent Hill is the most obvious factor: the controls. Ah yes, tank controls. People tend to avoid this like the plague for whatever reason. I feel like it's the longest running buzzword, and an excuse not to play some of these gems. If you don't already know, tank controls are as they sound. Forward is forward, backward is back. But instead of left and right moving you left and right, they turn your character. One of the great things about these controls is that they don't really age. But, without getting into an hour-long discussion on the subject, Silent Hill's offerings are a little different than what the phrase would have you believe. There's momentum involved, no hard stops or immediate takeoffs. You can strafe, have a decent amount of control over your camera, and can actually move while attacking. Something not typically seen in this style. You use these controls to navigate the titular town of Silent Hill, its streets filled with fog, darkness, and nightmarish abominations. Silent Hill, like most survival horror games of this kind, is pretty light on story content at a surface level. There are a few scenes sprinkled in between each major area of the game that are dialogue dense, but most of the lore and smaller pieces to the puzzle are spread through memos, which also sprinkle in some information about the town, its history, and its inhabitants. The game proper starts with our protagonist, Harry Mason, getting into a car accident on his way to the town of Silent Hill. Upon awaking, he finds his daughter Cheryl has gone missing, and must traverse the seemingly deserted town in order to find her. Harry's journey, the people he meets, and the goals of all those involved are mostly clear, but understanding what happened to the town and what's causing all the events within will require a bit more attention. The game isn't direct in its storytelling, but the story itself doesn't lack direction, and it is up to the player to put the pieces together and see what happened and what is still happening in the background. The search for Cheryl brings Harry through a varied mix of locations throughout the town. A local school, hospital, the sewers, and residential neighborhoods, but you'll also spend a lot of time wandering the streets too. All of these locations will at one point or another change as the story progresses, and the darkness of the other world bleeds into the town. Aside from visual changes, this also alters the structure of the areas, introducing new obstacles, puzzles, and enemies, necessitating a different path through the existing layout. These changes offer a twist on what you would consider backtracking, an obscure and otherwise linear journey. And right as it would wear out, the game offers a different structure, with smaller areas that need less trips back and forth to complete. What the game boils down to is pretty simple and traditional when looking at the gameplay. You navigate the town, find out more about the story, discover a new location, complete a handful of puzzles and sometimes defeat a boss, then more story, and the cycle repeats. It doesn't drag, however. As you progress, the pace of the game gets quicker, and each section of the game is notably different, offering a decent amount of variety and focus, with overall navigation changing as you progress between otherwise mundane areas. But these areas are mundane in name only. Silent Hill oozes atmosphere, Even when it's not casting a hellish shadow over the town, you can see and feel the meticulous attention to detail. It's more impressive when you consider that a lot of the other great-looking games of the time use pre-rendered backgrounds, where Silent Hill primarily renders its town in real time, using fog and darkness to mask draw distance and essentially add a layer to the world around the player. There are many titles in the PlayStation 1's catalog that pushed it to its limits graphically, but there are fewer that used the limitations to its advantage, quite like Silent Hill, with imagery and graphics enhanced by the murky drawbacks of the hardware. That's all there is, really. With traditional survival horror design, the game is somewhat short. New players should find themselves completing it within 6 hours, and expert players being able to bring that down to under an hour, which is on par for these games. I focused a lot on the town and its design, as the gameplay itself is simple enough unless you get hung up on the tank controls. And you have the option of limiting combat to just bosses, with escaping and avoiding enemies a viable option, with maneuvering and manipulating the senses of the enemies. In the end, Silent Hill lives up to its reputation, with a dense atmosphere that has few peers in the survival horror space, and while the gameplay isn't for everyone, it is as structured now as when it came out. The story of the game offers multiple layers that will satisfy whether you just want to help Harry look for his daughter, or if you want to dig into what happened to the town and why. With all this in mind, I'd recommend Silent Hill to both fans and newcomers to the genre, not only because of its history, but because of what it offers as a well-paced, relatively compact experience.